On the morning of the 17th of December, 1944, a young American military policeman standing at a crossroads in eastern Belgium put his hand up and stopped a jeep carrying an American general. The general was Omar Bradley, commander of the 12th Army Group, responsible for more than 1 million men. The MP had a rifle, a helmet, frozen fingers, and a list of questions. He asked Bradley where Chicago was. Bradley told him Illinois. He asked him about the position between the guard and the tackle on a football line. Bradley said guard. Then the MP asked him to name the capital of Illinois, and Bradley said Springfield, and the MP arrested him, because the MP thought the capital of Illinois was Chicago. Bradley was held long enough to be thoroughly annoyed and then released, and the story has been told 1,000 times as a joke about American education. It is not a joke about American education. It is the visible surface of something much stranger, and if you follow it down far enough, it takes you to the middle of the argument this whole video is about. For roughly a week that December, the American Army in the Ardennes was terrified of its own vehicles. Sentries were pulling over jeeps and demanding that the men inside prove they were American. Officers were being marched off at gunpoint by their own privates. Eisenhower, the supreme commander of the entire Allied effort in Europe, was effectively locked inside his own headquarters at Versailles over Christmas because his security staff believed German commandos were hunting him. Roads were jammed. Messages went undelivered. Men who should have been driving toward the front were sitting at checkpoints reciting baseball trivia. The cause of all of it was about 30 vehicles, not 30 tanks, not 30 aircraft. 30 stolen American quarter-ton trucks, driven by German soldiers wearing American uniforms, in an operation that Adolf Hitler had personally ordered, and that the man running it had built around one specific requirement. He had told the German High Command that he needed captured American jeeps, and that nothing his own country produced would do the job. Sit with that. Germany in the autumn of 1944 could still build the Tiger II, the Me-262, and a ballistic missile that reached London from the edge of space. And when its most celebrated commando officer planned the most ambitious operation of his career, he wrote a shopping list, and near the top of it, above the tanks, was a request for 100 captured examples of an American vehicle that cost $738 and had been designed in 5 days by an out-of-work engineer in a half-empty drafting room in western Pennsylvania. He got about 30. He used every single one. That is the story. Not the one about a cute little truck that soldiers were fond of. The one about a machine the losing side kept trying to steal, and that the man who commanded the largest amphibious invasion in history later named, in writing, as one of the 4 things that mattered most to victory. In 1948, Dwight Eisenhower published his account of the war in Europe. Somewhere in the middle of it, without any drum roll, he wrote that 4 pieces of equipment were regarded by most senior officers as being among the most vital to Allied success in Africa and Europe. He listed the bulldozer, the jeep, the 2.5-ton truck, the C-47 transport aircraft, and then he added a short observation that historians have been chewing on ever since. Not one of the 4, he noted, was designed for combat. Not one of them was built to kill a human being. The man who had run the entire war in the West looked back at the Shermans and the Liberators and the battleships, and the 4 things he named were a machine for pushing dirt, a machine for hauling cargo, a machine for carrying paratroopers, and a small truck that a farm boy from Iowa could take apart with a wrench and a hammer. So why? What did that thing actually do? To answer that, you have to go backwards, to a problem the United States Army had been failing to solve for about 80 years, and to a piece of American countryside in the summer of 1939, where the failure was on public display. The problem was mud. That sounds trivial. It is not. An army does not run on courage. It runs on the movement of small things across short distances at speed. A message from a battalion commander to his forward company. A reel of wire. A box of ammunition. A wounded man. A scout who needs to tell somebody what he has seen in the next 20 minutes rather than the next 4 hours. Get that right and an army reacts faster than its enemy can think. Get it wrong, and you have a great many brave men standing in a field waiting for orders that arrive too late to matter. For most of history, the answer was the horse, which eats whether you are fighting or not and is slow. The First World War exposed both flaws so brutally that every serious army spent the 20s and 30s looking for something else. The Americans tried motorcycles. In the summer of 1939, the United States First Army held maneuvers around Plattsburgh in upstate New York, with something like 50,000 troops taking part, the biggest peacetime exercise the country had ever staged. What happened on those dirt roads was a shambles. Motorcycles went over sideways in wet ruts and broke their riders' collarbones. They could not climb a moderate hill with a passenger and a radio, could not carry a stretcher, could not tow anything, and could not be lifted out of a ditch by 4 men. The staff cars, which were essentially civilian Fords, were superb right up to the edge of the pavement, and then became ornaments. One man watching mattered more than the rest. He was 58, a graduate of the Virginia Military Institute, and he had spent 1918 in France as an operations officer pushing hundreds of thousands of men through the mud of the Meuse Argonne. He knew what mud did to an order. His name was George Marshall, and on the 1st of September 1939, the day German troops crossed into Poland, he was sworn in as Chief of Staff of the United States Army. He had been arguing for years that the Army needed a small, fast, cross-country scout car, and had been ignored for years by Congress and by a peacetime establishment with no reason to fund one. Now Poland was burning, and he had run out of years. What almost nobody outside a small circle knew is that the answer had already been half-built, twice by soldiers in the field, without anybody important paying attention. At Fort Benning, Georgia, in 1937, an infantry captain named Robert Howie and a master sergeant named Melville Wiley put together a machine so odd that it is difficult to describe with a straight face. They took a stripped chassis, dropped it as low to the ground as they could physically manage, gave it 4 wheels and a small engine scavenged from an Austin, and arranged it so the driver and gunner lay flat on their stomachs, faces about a foot above the dirt, with a machine gun mounted between them. It looked like a coffee table that had learned to move. The soldiers who saw it called it the belly flopper. It was, in most practical senses, terrible. You could not carry cargo on it, you could not get out of it quickly, and nobody wanted to spend a day face down on a steel plate crossing a plowed field. But senior officers watched it go places a motorcycle and a staff car could not, fast enough to matter, and they could not unsee that. The belly flopper was shown off and then quietly parked, and the idea stayed lodged in the heads of the men at the Quartermaster Corps who wrote requirements. The pressure came on the 22nd of June 1940, when France signed an armistice in a railway carriage at Compiègne. That was the moment the argument in Washington ended. If the finest army in Europe could be dismantled in 6 weeks, then the United States Army, which at that point ranked somewhere below Portugal in size, was in genuine danger. 19 days after the French surrender, on the 11th of July 1940, the Quartermaster Corps sent a specification to 135 American automobile manufacturers. The terms are the reason this story has a hero in it. The Army wanted 4-wheel drive, empty weight no more than 1,300 pounds, payload of 600 pounds, roughly half its own weight, a 75-inch wheelbase, a fold-down windshield, a 2-speed transfer case, blackout lighting, a rear bench for 3 men, and a mount for a machine gun. It had to crawl at 3 miles an hour and also run at 50. Bids were due in 11 days. A running, driving, complete prototype was due in 49 days. The manufacturers read that document and, in overwhelming numbers, they laughed at it. The 1,300-pound weight limit alone was regarded as fantasy, and they were right about that, because no 4-wheel drive vehicle meeting the rest of the specification has ever weighed 1,300 pounds. The deadline was regarded as an insult. Detroit at that moment was being handed the largest industrial expansion in the history of the world, and had no interest in a rush job on a tiny scout car for a peacetime army. Of 135 companies, 2 answered. One was Willys Overland of Toledo, Ohio, a mid-sized manufacturer with a good engine and serious financial problems. The other was a company in Butler, Pennsylvania, called the American Bantam Car Company, and Bantam's situation was worse than serious. Bantam had been building tiny economy cars derived from the British Austin 7, in a country that had decided it did not want tiny economy cars. It was nearly bankrupt. Its plant was mostly idle. It had already let go of its engineering staff. Ford came in a little later, after the Army invited them. So here is the position American Bantam was in during the third week of July 1940. It had 11 days to submit a complete bid with blueprints, weights, cost breakdowns, and a supplier list. It had 49 days after that to build the thing and drive it to Maryland. And it did not employ a single engineer capable of designing it. What it had was a phone number. The phone number belonged to a 56-year-old freelance engineer in Detroit named Carl Probst. He was the son of a country doctor from Point Pleasant, West Virginia. He had been drawing cars since the earliest years of the automobile industry. He had worked for a string of companies that no longer existed, and in the summer of 1940, he was between contracts and short of money. Bantam's president, Frank Fenn, called him and asked him to come to Butler and design a vehicle for the United States Army in under a week, on speculation, with no guarantee of payment, because Bantam had no money to guarantee it with. Probst said no. Bantam called again. Probst said no again. And that would have been the end of it, except that a man named William Knudsen got involved. Knudsen was a Danish immigrant who had gone from a bicycle factory to the presidency of General Motors, and Franklin Roosevelt had just pulled him out of Detroit and put him in charge of coordinating American industrial mobilization for $1 a year. Knudsen telephoned Carl Probst personally and told him that his country needed him to do this. Probst got in his car on the 17th of July and drove east. He arrived in Butler and walked into a drafting room that was largely empty of people. Bantam's chief engineer, Harold Christ, and a handful of men who had stayed on were there. Probst took his jacket off and started drawing. He worked through Wednesday night. He worked all day Thursday. By Friday afternoon, the 19th of July, he had the complete general layout of the vehicle on paper, and he had done it by making one decision that separated him from everybody else who had looked at the problem, which was that he did not try to invent anything. Almost every component in Probst's design already existed and was already in production somewhere in the American Midwest. The engine was a Continental 4-cylinder side valve unit of about 45 horsepower, built for industrial work. The transmission came from Warner Gear. The transfer case came from Spicer. The axles were modified Studebaker units. The wheels, the brakes, and the electrics came out of catalogs. What Probst invented was the arrangement. He worked out how to package a real four-wheel drive powertrain and a usable body inside a wheelbase of 80 inches, at a weight and a cost that would allow a country to build hundreds of thousands of them and repair them in a field in New Guinea, using parts that a truck driver in Ohio would recognize. That is the entire secret. It is worth stopping on, because the German engineering establishment never once approached a problem this way, and by 1944, that difference was going to matter more than any amount of metallurgy. Probst took Friday evening off and went to the movies. Over the weekend, he and Christ finished the weight estimates and the costings. And here they hit their one real problem, which was that they knew perfectly well the vehicle could not be built to weigh 1,300 pounds. Nobody's could. Probst's estimate came out well over that. He wrote the honest number on the drawings anyway and signed the bid, and on Monday morning, the 22nd of July, he and Christ drove the paperwork to the Quartermaster Corps test facility at Camp Holabird on the southeastern edge of Baltimore. 5 days. From an empty drafting board to a complete government bid package for the most produced military vehicle America would build in the Second World War. Willys had bid too, undercutting Bantam on price and asking for more time to deliver. The Army had no time to give anybody. Bantam got the contract, and the clock started. On the 23rd of September, 1940, the finished prototype rolled out of the Bantam factory in Butler. It had no name yet. Around the plant, they were calling it the Blitz Buggy. It was painted, it was running, and it was late in the day. Bantam could not afford to ship it. So Christ and Probst got in it and drove it to Maryland. 250 miles, on the roads of 1940, in a vehicle that had been assembled by hand over the preceding weeks, with the future of the company sitting in the seat next to them. They pulled up to the gate at Camp Holabird about half an hour before the deadline expired. The Army then took that vehicle and did to it everything it could think of. They ran it up grades that a standard truck could not climb. They ran it through sand and water. They loaded it far past its rating and kept going. The board's report was close to euphoric. One of the officers involved later said the little machine did everything but climb trees. It exceeded the specification on every point except weight, and on weight the Army quietly accepted reality and revised the limit upward. And then the Army did something to American Bantam that has left a bad taste in the mouth of everyone who has ever looked closely at this story. It took Bantam's blueprints and handed them to Willys Overland and to Ford. The legal argument was probably correct. Public money had paid for the development, so the drawings belonged to the government, and the government could hand them to whomever it liked. The practical argument was harder to dismiss. Bantam had limited floor space, no capital, and no way to build 100,000 vehicles a year, and 100,000 vehicles a year was precisely what the Army was about to need. Karl Probst was furious. Frank Fenn was furious. There was nothing either of them could do. Willys and Ford engineers were invited to Camp Holabird to inspect the Bantam and, by several accounts, to measure it. Within months, both companies produced their own prototypes, the Willys Quad and the Ford Pygmy, which were recognizably the same vehicle. And here is the part I find genuinely difficult to be angry about, even knowing how Bantam was treated, because what Willys and Ford then did made the thing better. Willys had an engineering vice president named Delmar Roos, known to everybody as Barney, a Cornell graduate who had been chief engineer at Studebaker and who had spent 2 years taking a tired old 4-cylinder engine and rebuilding it into something formidable. He raised the compression, redesigned the cylinder head, put in a better crankshaft, and improved the lubrication until the engine would take punishment that had destroyed its predecessor. The version he started with had failed on a test stand after about 22 hours at full throttle. His version ran for 100 hours without coming apart. Willys called it the Go Devil. It produced 60 horsepower and, more importantly, 105 pound-feet of torque, which was far more than anything else in the competition. The Army wanted that engine. What the Army did not want was the weight of the Willys, which had come in badly over the new limit of 2,160 pounds. Roos was told to cut it or lose the contract. What followed is one of the great stories in American manufacturing, and it is almost entirely about ounces. Roos had his engineers weigh every component in the vehicle individually. They went to thinner steel where they could. They shortened bolts. They pulled cotton wadding out of the seat cushions. And in the version Willys' men told for the rest of their lives, they had the paint sprayed on in a thinner coat, because paint on a vehicle that size weighs something, and something was what they needed. They made the weight. By a matter of ounces, on a public scale, with an Army inspector watching. That is why the Jeep that went to war had a Willys engine in it. Ford contributed the face. Their people replaced the welded bar radiator grille with a single stamped steel panel with vertical slots in it, which was cheaper, lighter, and faster to make, and which is still, 80 years later, on the front of every Jeep sold in a showroom. By the summer of 1941, the Army had done the thing it needed to do most. It standardized. One design. Willys built it as the Model MB. Ford built the identical vehicle as the GPW, and the W in GPW stood for Willys, because Ford was manufacturing a Willys licensed design. Parts were interchangeable down to the bolt. A mechanic in Normandy could pull a component off a wrecked Ford and put it into a running Willys without thinking about it. Bantam, which had invented the thing, built 2,675 of them, and was then pushed out of vehicle production entirely. It spent the war building trailers, about 74,000 of them, for the Jeeps it should have been building. It never made another car. It went bankrupt in 1950, and was absorbed by a steel company 6 years after that. In 1948, the Federal Trade Commission looked into the affair and ruled that Willys had been claiming credit that was not theirs, and that the design honors belonged to American Bantam. By then, it made no practical difference to anyone. Now, about the name. Nobody knows for certain where the word came from, and anybody who tells you they do is selling something. There are two respectable theories, and they may both be partly true. The first is that it came out of Ford's own parts nomenclature, where the vehicle was designated GP, and that soldiers slurred the two letters into a single syllable. The second is that it came from a cartoon. In 1936, the Popeye comic strip introduced a small creature called Eugene the Jeep, who could walk through walls, disappear, solve impossible problems, and only ever said one word. Soldiers in the late 30s had already started attaching the name to any new vehicle that did something unexpected. What is documented is the moment the word went public. On the 20th of February 1941, a Willys test driver named Irving Hausman took one of the prototypes to Washington to demonstrate it for congressmen and reporters, and he drove it up the steps of the United States Capitol. A journalist asked him what the thing was called. Hausman had been out at Holabird listening to soldiers, and he told her it was a Jeep. She printed it. The name never came off. So what was it, actually, next to the machine the Germans were building for the same job? The German equivalent was the Volkswagen Type 82, the Kübelwagen. And I want to be fair to it, because it is routinely dismissed by people who have never looked at the engineering. Ferdinand Porsche's team did something quite clever with it. It was extremely light, around 1,570 pounds, which meant it floated over soft ground that heavier vehicles sank into. It had reduction gears in the rear hubs, which gave it ground clearance and multiplied its torque. It had a self-locking differential. Its air-cooled engine had no radiator to freeze in Russia, and no coolant to boil in Libya. In deep sand, it could sometimes go places a Jeep struggled to follow, but it had 2 wheels driving, not 4. Its engine produced about 24 horsepower, later around 25. It could not tow an anti-tank gun. It could not carry a serious load. It could not climb a wet slope with 4 men and a radio aboard. And it could not be fixed by a mechanic who had never seen one before, because almost nothing on it was shared with any vehicle the German army already operated. Germany built about 50,000 Kübelwagens across the entire war. America built roughly 647,000 Jeeps. At peak, the Willys plant in Toledo was completing one every 80 seconds. In the autumn of 1943, the Americans got hold of a Kübelwagen captured in North Africa and shipped it back across the Atlantic to be measured, weighed, driven, and taken apart. The verdict appeared in a War Department intelligence publication issued on the 15th of March 1945, the Handbook on German Military Forces, and it is one of the coldest sentences ever written about a rival's engineering. The Volkswagen, the manual said, was the German equivalent of the Jeep, and it was inferior in every respect except the comfort of its seats. That sentence is often quoted as an insult. I do not think it was one. I think it was a description of 2 countries answering the same question with completely different assumptions about who the answer was for. The Germans built a finished object, designed by brilliant men, to be operated correctly. The Americans built an unfinished one and handed it to 2 million young men with no instructions about what they were allowed to do to it. The first people to fully understand what that meant were not American at all. They were British, and they figured it out in the Egyptian desert in the summer of 1942. The Special Air Service was barely a year old then, semi-official, and regarded by much of the Cairo staff as a nuisance. It had been founded by a 26-year-old Scots Guards officer named David Stirling, who had been sent down from Cambridge, nearly killed himself in an experimental parachute jump, and talked his way into a general's office on crutches. His argument was that a handful of trained men placing charges on parked aircraft at night could destroy more of the Luftwaffe than the RAF could shoot down in the air, for a fraction of the cost. He was right, and the early raids proved it. But they were slow. The SAS relied on the long-range desert group to haul them out in heavy trucks. The men dismounted miles away, walked in, and walked out. As German security tightened, the walking-in part became close to suicidal. Then, in the early summer of 1942, Sterling was given a small batch of American jeeps. They were among the first to reach the desert. He looked at them and understood something that had not occurred to the people who built them. These were not transport. These were a weapons platform. His men stripped them. Off came the windshields, the bumpers, anything that added weight or caught light. Onto them went Vickers K machine guns, aircraft weapons taken from obsolete biplanes, in twin mounts front and rear. 4 guns per vehicle, each gun capable of something close to 1,000 rounds a minute. Into the back went fuel cans, water condensers, ammunition, and the small incendiary charges the SAS used to set aircraft on fire. On the night of the 26th of July, 1942, 18 of those jeeps left a hideout on the northern edge of the Katara Depression and drove about 50 miles across open desert toward a German airfield called Sidi Hanaish. Sidi Hanaish was where the Luftwaffe was staging the Junkers 52 transports that flew fuel and ammunition to Rommel's tanks. Their navigator, a former LRDG man named Mike Sadler, took them across 50 miles of featureless ground at night, using the stars, and found the field. They did not sneak in. They formed 2 columns, headlights off, and drove straight onto the field. Sterling fired a green flare and 72 machine guns opened up at once. Picture it from the German side. You are a mechanic asleep in a tent beside a line of parked transports, hundreds of miles behind the front, and the desert to your south turns into a wall of tracer moving at 30 miles an hour. They drove the length of the field and back, burning aircraft as they went. In about 15 minutes, they destroyed or wrecked somewhere around 37 aircraft. They lost 1 jeep and 1 man on the field, a 21-year-old Lance bombardier named John Robson. The next morning, with the surviving vehicles scattered and hiding, Stukas caught the French detachment in the open and killed a young paratrooper named André Zernheld, whose prayer, found among his papers, is still recited by French airborne troops. In the 15 months between the day Sterling first bolted a machine gun to a jeep and the day a German patrol caught him asleep in a Tunisian wadi in January 1943, the SAS destroyed more than 250 Axis aircraft on the ground, along with fuel dumps, supply depots, and miles of telephone line. Every Junkers 52 burned at Sidi Hanaish was fuel that did not reach Rommel's panzers the following week. Sterling spent the rest of the war in German custody, escaping repeatedly, until they gave up and put him in Colditz. Everything the SAS had discovered, the American Army was about to discover everywhere else in 10,000 smaller ways, mostly without asking anyone's permission. A sergeant with a welding torch could bolt brackets to the back and turn it into an ambulance carrying 2 stretcher cases lying flat, with a third across the hood if the day was bad enough. 2 lengths of pipe welded to the bumper with a notch cut in the top made a wire cutter, which mattered enormously in Normandy, where retreating Germans strung cable across sunken lanes at throat height. Flanged wheels turned a jeep into a locomotive running on captured French track. A pintle mount behind the front seats carried a Browning 50. A winch on the nose pulled trucks out of bogs. In Burma, jeeps took ammunition and plasma up jungle tracks that engineers had written off as impassable in monsoon. None of that was designed in Toledo or Dearborn. It was designed by corporals, out of salvage, using the same instinct that had turned the Model T into 1,000 different farm implements across the American Midwest in the 1920s. The most extreme version was the airborne jeep. To fit one inside a glider, crews stripped the windshield, cut down the bumper, pulled off the handles, and lashed the thing to the deck with steel cable. British gliders put jeeps into Arnhem in September 1944 to tow 6-pounder anti-tank guns into the streets where the 1st Airborne made its stand at the bridge. American jeeps came into Normandy and Holland by Waco glider with the 82nd and the 101st, and more than 200 came across the Rhine in March 1945 with a single glider regiment. The men jumped by parachute. The jeeps came in on wings, in silence, and quite often upside down. Ernie Pyle, the war correspondent who rode in them across North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and France, until a Japanese machine gun killed him on Aishima in April 1945, wrote a dispatch in the summer of 1943 in which he said he did not believe the war could be continued without the Jeep. He described it as faithful as a dog, and said it habitually carried twice what it had been designed for and kept going anyway. Pyle was not a man who wrote sentimental things about equipment. He wrote about men. The Jeep was the only machine he ever really loved. But if you talk to the men themselves, or read what they wrote afterward, the thing they remember first is almost never the machine gun mount or the glider. It is the ambulance. The trucks of the medical companies could not get to a forward foxhole. Jeeps could. They went up under artillery fire with a red cross painted on a canvas tarp, loaded men who had been hit 15 minutes earlier, and bounced them back over torn ground to a battalion aid station where a surgeon still had a chance. In the First World War, roughly 8% of American wounded who reached medical care died of their wounds. In the Second, that figure fell to about 4%. Sulfa drugs did part of that. Plasma did part of it. Penicillin from 1943 did part of it. But none of it works if the man does not arrive, and for enormous numbers of American soldiers, arriving meant a quarter-ton truck driven by a 19-year-old with the windshield folded flat. Every one of those runs left paper behind it, a line entry on a morning report, a casualty card, an admission sheet at a field hospital, a unit diary, a telegram that arrived at a house in Ohio with almost nothing in it. Families were usually told a fraction of what happened, and the rest went into filing cabinets and stayed there. It is still there. If you have a name, a photograph, and a box of objects nobody ever explained, an American serviceman's war can be reconstructed from those records, piece by piece. That is what my book, Find Your Grandfather's War, is for. The link is in the description if you want it. Which brings us back to a crossroads in Belgium, and a general being arrested by his own military police. On the 22nd of October 1944, Hitler summoned a Waffen-SS lieutenant colonel named Otto Skorzeny to the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia. Skorzeny was a large, scarred Viennese officer who had been given the propaganda credit a year earlier for the glider raid that plucked Mussolini off a mountaintop, an operation actually planned and led by a Luftwaffe paratroop officer named Harold Moors. Hitler had a new job for him, and it was the last card the German army had left. Skorzeny was to raise a brigade of English-speaking German soldiers, dress them in American uniforms, put them in American vehicles, and run them through the American lines in the opening hours of the Ardennes offensive. They were to seize bridges over the Meuse, cut wire, turn road signs around, and poison the American rear so thoroughly that nobody in it could trust an order or a face. The operation was named Greif, after the mythical griffin. Skorzeny sat down and wrote out what he needed. He asked for 15 captured tanks, 20 armored cars, 20 self-propelled guns, 40 motorcycles, 120 trucks, and 100 American Jeeps. Look at that list again. He was an SS officer of a nation with an enormous armaments industry, requesting American vehicles from his own high command in writing, because his own country's equivalent would not do the job. He was not asking out of admiration. He was asking because a Jeep at an American checkpoint gets waved through, and because a Jeep will cross the sort of frozen forest track the Ardennes is made of, and because the Kubelwagen sitting in a German motor pool would do neither. He was promised 20 Sherman tanks. He received 2, of which one ran. He got 4 scout cars, about 15 trucks, and roughly 30 Jeeps. The rest of his fleet consisted of German vehicles painted olive drab with white stars stenciled on the doors, which fooled nobody who looked twice. The English was worse. He screened around 2,500 volunteers, and found about 10 who spoke American English with real idiom. Another 30 or 40 managed it without the slang. The rest ranged from schoolroom English down to men who could say yes and point. So the raid itself achieved very little. A few wire cuts, a few signposts turned. Some traffic sent the wrong way. As a military operation, it failed. As psychological warfare, it was one of the cheapest successes of the war, and Skorzeny had almost nothing to do with that part. The Americans did it to themselves. Word got out that Germans in American uniforms were driving American jeeps behind the lines, and within a day the rear of the First Army had turned into one long interrogation. Men were asked who Betty Grable was married to and which league the Dodgers played in. Bradley was arrested over Springfield. Montgomery, who declined to be questioned by anybody, had his tires shot out. Eisenhower's staff, told assassination squads were hunting him, sealed him inside his headquarters over Christmas, and put a double in his car. A few dozen men in stolen quarter-ton trucks came closer to jamming the Allied command system than several German divisions managed with tanks and artillery in the same offensive. The men themselves paid for it. Around 18 of Skorzeny's commandos were taken in American uniform and shot as spies, which was legal under the laws of war as they stood. The first three, Günther Billing, Manfred Pernas, and Wilhelm Schmidt, were tried at Henri Chapelle in Belgium and executed by firing squad on the 23rd of December, 1944. Most of the rest followed before the end of the month. Skorzeny survived, stood trial at Dachau in 1947, and was acquitted, partly because a former British Special Operations officer testified that the Allies had considered doing exactly the same thing. That is what the German army thought of the Jeep. Not a quote. A requisition order, and it fits a pattern that runs right through the war. In North Africa, Wehrmacht units repainted captured Jeeps with black crosses and used them so routinely that German inventories had to be adjusted to account for foreign vehicles in service. In Italy, in France, wherever they took one intact, they kept it. Which raises the obvious question. Why not build their own? Not because German engineers were incapable. Because Germany was fighting on an industrial base that could not afford to standardize, under a doctrine that never treated small unit mobility as the main event. Germany went to war in 1939 with something like 514,000 horses. By February 1945, with the factories being bombed flat, the Wehrmacht was working roughly 1.2 million of them, more than twice what it had used to conquer Poland. The picture most of us carry of the German army, the Panzer Division pouring across a border in a cloud of dust, was accurate for a thin layer at the very front. Behind that layer, the German army moved the way armies had moved since Caesar. On foot, at 3 miles an hour, with a horse pulling the cart. The American Army of 1944 was the first substantially motorized army in the history of warfare, and the chassis that transformation rested on was not a tank. Now, about the title of this video, because I want to be honest with you about what the evidence does and does not say. Beginning in 1945, the United States Army Historical Division sat the captured senior officers of the German Army down at facilities in Hesse, gave them paper, and asked them to write the war down from their side. Franz Halder, the former chief of the General Staff, ended up running the editorial end of it. The program produced around 2,500 manuscripts, most of them now at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. It is the largest body of senior German analysis of that war anywhere in the world. If you go looking in those manuscripts for a German general saying the words "the American Jeep was the best weapon of the war," you will have a frustrating afternoon. They mostly do not name it. They blame Hitler. They blame the weather, the bombing, the oil, the Russians, the fuel that never arrived. But read what they describe, rather than what they conclude, and the Jeep is on almost every page without being named once. They describe American units that shifted weight from one sector to another faster than a German staff could issue orders to meet them. They describe American reconnaissance appearing deep inside their positions before anyone knew a gap existed. They describe American casualties disappearing from the battlefield within the hour and reappearing in the line weeks later. They describe American forward companies that were never quite out of ammunition, never quite out of wire, never quite out of contact with the men behind them, and therefore never quite gave a German commander the pause he needed to reorganize. Every one of those things, on the ground, at battalion level, came down to the same small four-wheel drive truck moving on 4 different errands at once, while its German opposite number did them one after another, on foot or behind a horse. That is the verdict, and it is worth more than a quotation would be, because it was written by men who had no reason to flatter anybody, and who were describing what had happened to them. The Jeep did not win a single battle. It never destroyed a position or broke a line. What it did was allow every other American thing to arrive in time to matter. The artillery observer got to the ridge. The order got to the company. The wire got laid. The wounded man got to the surgeon. The ammunition got forward before the attack came in. Eisenhower named 4 machines, none of which was built to fight, and he was telling us something that armies keep having to relearn. Wars are not decided only by what you can destroy. They are decided by what you can move, and how fast, and how often. Karl Prupps drew it in 5 days and never got rich from it. He died at his home in Dayton, Ohio in August 1963, at 79, and the man who laid out the most produced American military vehicle of the war is not a household name in his own country. American Bantam built it first and was destroyed by the contract it won. David Sterling turned it into a weapon and spent the rest of the war behind wire. Ernie Pyle, who loved it more than any other object in the United States Army, was killed on a small island in the Pacific 4 months before it all ended. Most of those 647,000 vehicles were scrapped. The survivors go to auction now, bought by men whose grandfathers might have driven one off a landing craft at Salerno or Cherbourg, or through the wreckage of Manila. The men who built them and drove them and bled in them are nearly all gone. The little truck they made is about the closest thing they have to a monument, and it is still, 80 years on, the only vehicle from that war that anyone would recognize on sight without being told.